Hey guys, tonight we begin with one of the most charming little pandemics in human history, the Black Death. A delightful 14th century event that combined poor hygiene, terrible medical advice, and fleas with an attitude problem. Tonight we ask, what could you have? Done to make it out alive. And just don't get sick doesn't count, so before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's start with your first and probably most important life choice. Where are you living? If you said a bustling 14th century city full of opportunity and culture, congratulations. You're already 85% of dead cities during the Black Plague were not charming medieval postcards. They were overpopulated, unwashed, and alarmingly enthusiastic about throwing waste into the streets. Imagine thousands of people crammed together in wooden buildings with no plumbing, no sanitation, and rats so comfortable they probably paid rent in urban centres like London, Paris and Florence, where the plagues are all-you-can-eat buffets, close quarters and open gutters. Check livestock living indoors. You bet the cities are a hotbed of human contact, pest activity and very bad smells. If airborne pathogens didn't get you, the psychological trauma of daily smells probably would. You didn't even need to be sick, just near someone who was. Markets. Churches were bathhouses on the rare occasion they were open and packed people into tight spaces. Fleas loved it, rats thrived, and you, the innocent city dweller just trying to buy onions, were one bite away from a full-body breakdown. Now contrast this with the countryside. Yes, it had its downsides, like isolation, weather, and the occasional angry goose, but crucially, it had space. You had fewer neighbours, fewer crowds, and significantly fewer rats. Per square foot, if you lived on a farm or in a sleepy village up a hill where the nearest human lived 2 goat lengths away, your chances of survival were dramatically better, even in remote monasteries. Some religious orders, like the Carthusians, practiced near total silence and isolation. Their lifestyle wasn't designed for plague survival, but it just happened to be the medieval equivalent of an elite quarantine bubble. In short, if you valued your lungs, your blood, and your continued existence, the best move in 1348 was to get as far away from people as legally or illegally possible, cancel your trips, and leave the market early. And if anyone says it's probably not that bad, that's your cue to grab your cloak and leave the city immediately. Imagine this, it's 1349, and someone sneezes in your general direction. Do you A, politely ask if they're okay, B, offer them a clove of garlic, C, run like your life depends on it, because it does? Correct answer. C always said back then no one knew what a virus was, but they did understand one thing. If someone near you started sweating, coughing or bleeding from strange places, it was time to become a recluse. Social distancing didn't have a catchy name yet, but the survivors practiced it religiously. Plague was thought to be spread by bad air, also known as miasma. This wasn't completely accurate. It was the fleas, not the fog, but avoiding other humans who reeked of decay, accidentally excellent advice. People who withdrew early to the countryside, to a family cottage, or to anywhere that wasn't full of suspicious coughing had much better odds of making it out alive. Entire families survived by simply closing the door and not opening it until the next year. Did it strain relationships? Absolutely. Was it awkward when your cousin came knocking, begging for soup and sneezing through the keyhole? Extremely. But letting them in could mean you'd all be dead by Sunday. So no soup for cousin. Gregory, some nobles and wealthy families even fled their cities at the first sign of plague. The wealthy the Boccaccio family, for example, packed up and left Florence, social distancing with wine, poetry and zero peasant contact. Smart. Meanwhile, the less fortunate learned to self-isolate through trial and error, mostly error and markets, festivals, weddings. Any large gathering was a game of microbiological roulette. If you had the willpower to skip them and stay home and talk to your cat instead of your neighbour, you had a real shot at outliving the pandemic. It's simple. Every interaction was a potential death sentence. And while medieval people didn't have Twitter threads about flattening the curve, they did figure out very quickly that fewer handshakes meant more birthdays. If you were lucky enough to survive the Black Plague, chances are you weren't doing it in velvet. Let's talk fashion specifically. How your wardrobe could get you killed in 1348. The medieval upper class loved long flowing robes, fur-trimmed sleeves, and thick ornate fabrics that said, "I have money, and I definitely don't plan on fleeing quickly." But to fleas, that wasn't style, that was prime real estate. The plague wasn't picky, rich or poor. If you had fabric and skin, you were fair game. But the richer you were, the more layers you wore and the more space you gave fleas to move in, settle down and start a small family. In this way, your fashion sense could function like a hotel chain for parasites. What did work? Simplicity. Survivors tended to wear shorter tunics, less fabric, tighter sleeves and linen. The one fabric that fleas weren't writing love letters about. Bonus points. If you washed your clothes more than once a season, which, yes, was considered excessive by medieval standards, some communities went as far as burning entire wardrobes, thinking that disease clung to cloth. This wasn't entirely wrong. Fleas can survive for days without a host and happily hitch a ride on a favourite overcoat. That velvet cloak with the squirrel fur trim, it's not a flex if it's also carrying microscopic death. People also wore accessories, lots of them, but the beaded necklaces, perfumes and rosemary bundles weren't doing much to stop the plague unless you counted offending everyone's noses into keeping their distance. In which case, bravo. And if you're wondering about armour, no, it didn't help either. You couldn't sword fight the plague, though. Dying in full plate because you refused to remove your gauntlets long enough to wash your hands would be very on brand for certain nights if you were hoping to outlive the Black Plague. Geography was more than just scenic. It could literally save your skin, especially if that skin was far, far uphill. Medieval science had gaps. They didn't know what bacteria were, but they did notice patterns, like how people living on hills didn't drop dead quite as fast as those in swampy lowlands. Coincidence, maybe, but if your neighbour's corpse just fell over the fence, you probably wouldn't be sticking around to demand peer-reviewed studies. Elevation had a few sneaky advantages. First rats, then the little death. Chariots of the plague hated climbing, or rather, they hated staying at elevation, especially where food was scarce and temperatures dropped. The colder the hill, the less likely you were to host a flea festival. Second wind higher ground meant better air circulation, and while bad air, or miasma, wasn't the direct cause of the plague, fleeing stagnant, putrid-smelling alleys for crisp hilltop breezes was. That was a good call anyway. At the very least, it spared you. The aroma of medieval city life, a blend of human waste, goat hair, and desperation. Hills also came with the luxury of fewer people. That's right, elevation plus isolation. A winning combo in any century. Your plague couldn't spread if there was no one to catch it, and no one to breathe on you in line at the communal water barrel. Some monasteries and manors were already built on high ground, not for plague reasons, but because they liked the view and hated being invaded. But when the Black Death rolled through, those foundations suddenly felt visionary. You didn't need to be rich to head uphill. Even shepherds, goat herds, and that one guy who talked to birds had the right idea. Fresh air, no neighbours, and a steep walk deterring both the plague and surprise visits. And if someone from the valley came trudging up with a cough and a story about how they think it's just a cold. You had a valid excuse to roll a barrel downhill at them in self-defence. Let's start with the obvious. Medieval people were not famous for their love of soap or water or personal boundaries. By the 14th century, the Great Bathing, the Renaissance had hit a rough patch. Earlier medieval periods had public baths. Some were quite elaborate, but by the time the Black Death arrived, bathing was viewed with deep suspicion. Medical experts and I, who use that term generously, believed that hot water opened your pores and made you more vulnerable to disease. In other words, washing made you more likely to die. This, of course, was the opposite of true plague carrying. Fleas loved dirty, unwashed skin, especially the kind of skin buried under 3 layers of wool and last month's stew. People who bathed even infrequently were less attractive to parasites. They didn't know this, of course, they just thought they were unlucky. Enough to smell like sin. It turns out survival soap existed, but it was either homemade from ashes and animal fat or absurdly expensive. Still, some survivors washed their hands and faces regularly, even if it was more superstition than science. Others bathed with herbs, vinegar or wine, which was less effective but did make you smell like a salad. Someone prayed over clothes, which was another problem. Laundry was done, maybe once a month if you were rich, and typically involved beating your garments against a rock and hoping the lice took the hint. Those who took the time to boil their linens or change outfits weekly were not exactly clean by today's standards, but positively sterile by plague-era benchmarks, and let's not forget dental hygiene toothpaste. Didn't exist, but chewing mint leaves or rubbing salt on your teeth was a thing again. It didn't cure the plague, but it did make your deathbed conversations slightly more tolerable, as could a bath. Save your life, not directly, but it drastically reduced your chances of turning into a mobile flea banquet. Plus, it separated you from the crowd. Literally, people avoided you because you smelled weirdly clean. Medieval doctors, men of great confidence. Questionable hygiene and even worse theories if you found yourself getting a bit plaguey in 1349 and decided I'd better call a doctor. Congratulations, you've just made your final mistake. To be fair, they were doing their best with what little they understood, which was nothing. The leading theory of the time was the 4 humours: S, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If you were sick, it meant your humours were out of balance. The solution drained something, usually blood, occasionally dignity, so you'd show up coughing blood, and they'd respond by sticking leeches on you until you looked like a deflated wineskin. Or worse, they'd slice open a vein to let the bad out, which had the side effect of also letting you out. Then there was the plague. Doctors dressed in their iconic bird-beaked masks stuffed with flowers. Herbs and spices, the beak wasn't a fashion statement. It was their primitive version of PPE, they thought. Good smells warded off bad air, which wasn't totally wrong. If you define working as keeping you too dizzy to notice the smell of rotting bodies, their tools wooden sticks for poking at a safe distance, a cane for nudging you into a mass grave if things didn't go well, and a whole lot of sage burning. Treatment options were equally grim, rubbing onions on your armpits, drinking crushed emeralds, carrying a dead toad in a bag around your neck, sitting in smoke-filled rooms. In other words, if it sounded stupid, painful, or highly flammable, it was probably prescribed. Ironically, the people who fared best were often the ones who avoided medical attention. Altogether, like nuns, midwives, and herbalists, who stuck to basic hygiene, clean bandages, and staying calm in the midst of the Black Plague when cities turned into open-air morgues and doctors prescribed onions for everything short of decapitation. One group quietly outperformed everyone in the survival game. Monks, but not just any monks. We're talking about the stay-at-home, vow of silence type thing. Carthusians are not travelling friars with pockets, full of fleas. Why did monastic life offer such a plague? Proof of potential for starters. Monasteries were often isolated, perched on hillsides or nestled in rural nowhere. They were designed for prayer and reflection, not traffic festivals or overcrowded inns with that one guy coughing into his soup. Then there were the rules. Monastic life wasn't a free-for-all, it came with structure. Scheduled meals, strict sanitation by medieval standards, and a suspicious lack of hand-holding and shared utensils, not likely hugging spiritually discouraged group bathhouse orgies? Absolutely not. They also had access to food and clean water, a huge bonus when much of the population was too sick to farm or boil a pot. Monasteries stored grain, grew their own herbs, and most importantly didn't rely on urban markets swarming with rats and regret. Oh, and did we mention they were celibate, which meant no late-night visits to plaguey tavern wenches, just you, your thoughts, and the occasional Latin chant to keep you company. Now, not all monks made it out alive. Some bless them and choose to act as caregivers. They ventured into cities to help the sick noble. Yes, but statistically inadvisable travelling clergy had the worst of both worlds. Exposure to dying strangers and the inability to run away because it would have looked bad in the Bible. So if you were going the monk route, your best bet was to join early, stay put, and say no to missions, of course. You didn't have to be a monk to benefit from the monk lifestyle. You just needed to copy their habits, live in the middle of nowhere, grow your own food, and limit contact within the Black Death economy. Certain jobs came with a special bonus, immediate exposure to everyone's germs. Let's start with messengers. Their job was to ride between towns carrying letters, proclamations, or ominous royal decrees. No one wanted to hear about great cardio and terrible survival odds. Every time a messenger dismounted and handed over a scroll, they were essentially swapping paper and plague with whoever had just sneezed on the last delivery. Then there were merchants. The Uber Eats of the 14th century, minus hygiene and customer satisfaction. Then there were merchants, the Uber Eats of the 14th century, minus hygiene and customer satisfaction. Merchants travelled between cities, markets and ports, bringing spices, cloth and fleas from one contaminated location to the next. They were plague super spreaders before super spreading had a name. If you worked these gigs, you were the human equivalent of a courier pigeon with a death wish. So what jobs did give you a better shot? Blacksmiths, bakers, shepherds and millers, people who worked with fire grain or animals and mostly kept to themselves. These folks didn't need to travel far, they didn't have to shake hands with strangers. or enter plague-saturated cities for meetings that could have been parchment scrolls. Then there were gravediggers, morbid, yes, but oddly secure. The job wasn't Plagueiro, but they had better tools like gloves, shovels, and the highly underrated strategy of not touching things with your face. Some even learned to recognise early plague signs and took great pride in not dying like everyone else around them. If you were really lucky, you could be a recluse hermit or mildly disliked goat herder. Solitary work was suddenly in vogue. Your antisocial behaviour rebranded as wise pandemic planning. Even artisans like cobblers and weavers fared decently. They worked from home, took limited clients, and could pretend they were just booked. When someone sketchy knocked on the door, coughing and asking for shoes, in 1349, the fewer errands you ran, the longer you lived. Let's get one thing straight in Plague era. Europe rats weren't just background noise. They were main characters. Hairy, twitchy, plague chariot-riding villains in your everyday life. And they had one mission: to get into your food and leave you with a parting gift called Yinia. Pestis. If you wanted to survive the Black Death, one of the smartest things you could do besides running uphill and avoiding humans was to elevate your pantry. Literally grain bins on the floor. That's a rat rave waiting to happen. Open baskets of bread under your bed. Congratulations, you've opened a plague. Themed buffet. Rats weren't picky eaters, and neither were their fleas. The moment rodents set up shop in your pantry, your odds of living past Lent dropped faster than your grain reserves. Now some medieval households wised up. They stored food on high wooden shelves in ceramic jars, or inside suspended boxes hanging from the ceiling like weird piñatas that no one was allowed to hit. These weren't fancy design choices. They were desperate attempts to keep the plague at arm's length. And then there were cats, the underappreciated. MVPs of rodent control. The more felines you had prowling your kitchen, the better. Unfortunately, some places accused cats of being witches' familiars and killed them, which, spoiler alert, made the rat problem much worse. It's hard to survive when you've just executed your only line of defence. Also, let's talk about your trash. Throwing scraps out the window wasn't just rude, it was rat bait. The same went for leaving compost heaps next to your house like some kind of rodent. Airbnb smart survivors moved their waste far from their living quarters, preferably into someone else's yard. It's worth noting that rats didn't technically cause the plague. Their fleas did, but fleas don't travel long distances on their own. When disaster strikes, people tend to respond in one of two ways: calmly seeking rational solutions or joining a screaming torch-wielding mob convinced it's all the neighbours' fault. Guess which one was more popular in 1348? The Black Death didn't just kill bodies, it shattered brains, and with no germ theory, microscopes or decent leadership, folks were left to invent explanations. Many of them sounded like, "It must be them," followed by pitchforks, torches, and wildly misdirected violence. In some towns, mobs accused outsiders, Jews, foreigners, and basically anyone who looked like they hadn't sneezed recently. People believed wells were being poisoned, that the plague was punishment from God, that a local widow with too many cats had caused all this, with a suspicious herbal tea spoiler. None of it helped, in fact. Mob behaviour usually made things worse. You'd gather a large group of already paranoid people shout over each other about how he coughed near my cow, and then storm the victim's home to solve the plague by burning it down. Smart, real smart, worse. Still, mobs brought people together physically huddled in sweaty crowds, yelling and swapping bacteria like they were trading Pokemon cards. You didn't just risk making a moral mistake, you also risked contracting the very disease you were trying to blame on someone else. The people who actually survived the Black Death were often the ones who kept a low profile, not because they were cowards, but because they weren't interested in collective panic rituals while the mob was busy dragging an astrologer out of town for reading stars too confidently. Survivors were boarding up their windows, boiling water and quietly not dying. There's a lesson here. Panic spreads faster than plague, and angry crowds are rarely wise problem solvers. Unless you enjoy the smell of smoke, moral failure, and a guaranteed exposure to cough droplets, maybe don't grab the torch, because in a pandemic, the only thing more contagious than disease is ignorance at scale. Garlic. Nature's breath mint seasoning staple and medieval body spray of choice. When the plague arrived, people didn't have vaccines, antibiotics, or even a firm grasp on what a germ was. What they did have was garlic, and they used it for everything. They ate it raw, hung it over their doors, and wore it around their necks like cloves of aromatic defiance. Was it scientifically effective? Let's be honest, not really. But in a world where your other options included bathing in vinegar, drinking molten gold, or letting someone drill a hole in your skull to release the bad air, garlic was relatively reasonable. Why garlic? For one, it smelled strong, and that was a big deal. The leading theory of disease at the time was miasma, or bad air. So if you could overpower the smell of rotting corpses and human waste with something aggressively herbal, people figured you were on the path to health. Garlic was the Axe body spray of 1348, but there's a twist. Garlic is a mild antibacterial and insect repellent. Modern science confirms that it does in fact have some antimicrobial properties, so while medieval folks didn't know what they were doing, they may have accidentally made themselves less appealing to fleas, the actual plague carriers. That said, don't give garlic too much credit. It wasn't a magical shield. You couldn't rub a clove on your forehead and walk through a corpse, pile unscathed. Some people ate so much garlic they became socially unapproachable, which ironically did help with social distancing. Also, garlic didn't work if you were still doing everything else. Wrong-wearing flea-ridden robes, visiting sick neighbours, drinking from shared cups at a crowded funeral feast. All the garlic in the world wouldn't save you. You'd just die. Extra seasoned in the 14th century, the ability to smell something pleasant like roses wasn't just a charming sensory experience. It was basically a diagnostic tool. If your nose still worked, congratulations, you probably weren't dead. Yet the logic was simple. The plague often hit hard and fast, bringing along symptoms like fever, vomiting, swelling, and crucially, a sudden loss of the will to stand. One particularly disturbing sign was the onset of overwhelming stench, both from the sick person and the surrounding city. If you could smell flowers instead of rotting flesh, you were already ahead of the game. This is where the posy came in. People of means, or even just good instincts, carried little bouquets of herbs and flowers called pomanders or nosegays. These weren't romantic gestures. They were DIY gas masks made of lavender, mint, sage, and rose petals. You'd carry one in hand, stuff it in your sleeve, or just glue it to your face like a desperate. Was this Renaissance party favour effective technically? No, but symbolically it worked wonders walking around with a floral sack. He made you look like you were trying, which, during the plague, put you ahead of roughly half the population. The reasoning was again tied to my asthma. Theory. The idea that foul smells carried disease. So naturally, if you could overpower the stench with roses, You were cleansing. The air in practice. You were just giving yourself something to focus on that wasn't death. Plus, the people who used flowers and herbs often had the means to isolate, wash occasionally, and avoid the worst hit areas. So it wasn't the roses. Themselves, it was the lifestyle that came with them. Rose sniffers tended to avoid cesspits and street feasts. Also, people kept flowers in the home, burned incense and simmered herbs on coals, not because they were aromatherapists, but because living with 10 people in a one-room hut needed some kind of vibe adjustment, which frankly may have saved your life. Let's face it, the plague wasn't just a test of immunity, it was a test of your social calendar in a time when human contact was roughly as safe as licking a dagger. Friendship became inconvenient. Every hug, handshake or shared mug was a game of bacterial roulette, and the people with the best odds, the ones who politely declined all invitations forever, medieval survivors, were often those who lived quiet, uneventful lives, not because they were insightful virologists, but because they just didn't like people that much to begin with. In short, introverts thrived. That one neighbour who always said, "I'll come by later," and never did the couple who skipped every market arrive alive. Fair wedding feast and Saints' Day party also alive. The guy who muttered to his chickens and lived in a shed weird, but alive. The more friends you had, the more chances the plague had to hitch a ride into your home. Even kind gestures were dangerous, offering bread to a sick neighbour. Risky visiting your aunt to check in, deadly group prayer circles. Holy but highly contagious. Many survivors limited their contact to just a few close family members, and even that came with rules. Eat separately, avoid suspicious coughing, and if necessary build 2 houses and shout between windows. If someone sneezed, that was the medieval equivalent of being unfriended for life. It wasn't personal, it was survival math. Even monasteries and noble households practiced early forms of quarantine. If one person showed symptoms, they were sent to a different wing, or if you were poor, just told to go lie in the barn and we'll see. Here's the part no one likes to admit. Sometimes surviving the Black Death came down to dumb luck. Good choices helped. Sure, washing occasionally, avoiding festivals, not licking strangers. But even if you did everything right, a single flea with an attitude could ruin your whole life. That said, the odds really improved if you also happened to be extremely boring, because excitement in the 14th century often involved people movement, noise, and very bad decisions. It was the extroverts, the wanderers, and the just popping into town crowd who tended to get invited to funerals they didn't realise were their own. Survivors. They leaned into monotony. The plague didn't care how charismatic you were. It didn't care about your ambitions, your side hustle, or your dream to open a tavern in Bruges. It cared if you were within biting range, so the guy who spent his days tending beets and muttering about the weather was immune. No, but invisible to danger almost. There were also genetic flukes. Modern scientists believe some people carried mutations like the CCR5D32 gene that made them more resistant to the plague's effects. They didn't know that at the time, of course. They just thought, weird that I'm not bleeding from my armpits like everyone else. So yes, if you were genetically fortunate, living alone, mildly antisocial, fond of boiled water, and unreasonably attached to your cat, congratulations, you were medieval elite. But the moment you got creative, tried a new city, invited friends over, joined a flagellant parade, or drank from that mysterious shared chalice at the market, the odds turned boring meant routine meant fewer surprises, and fewer surprises meant fewer unexplained rashes, and less spontaneous organ failure. if you made it through the coughing, the bleeding, the rotting streets, and the awkwardly aggressive garlic breath. Congratulations, you've officially entered Plague Survivor territory, and now you face your final task. Make sure someone knows you are here, because surviving the Black Death wasn't just about avoiding death, it was about being remembered for it. Enter the scribes, the monks, the diary keepers, and the slightly traumatized villagers with a good memory and access to parchment. These were the real MVPs. Not only did they outlive everyone, they also had the energy to write about it. People like Giovanni Boccaccio, who gave us the Damiara and a book about wealthy Florentines hiding from the plague by telling stories in the countryside, or that one monk in Yorkshire who scribbled in the margins, "A great pestilence came, and many died." Minimalist but effective writing things down was more than just catharsis. It was a way to process what had happened, to pass on warnings, and to gently humble brag about your immune system survivors who recorded their stories, shaped how future generations understood the plague, and in doing so they turned not dying into a sort of legacy project. But here's the catch. You had to outlive the printing deadline that meant staying cautious even after the worst had passed. Many let their guard down too soon. They celebrated, reunited, hosted extremely premature feasts, and then died in the second wave. So if you truly wanted to make it to the end and write your story, don't rush back to town. Don't hug anyone just because the bishop said the plague is probably over. Don't accept free ale from the man with visible boils instead. Wait. Stay boring. Keep your diary nearby and observe, and when it is safe, really safe, pick up a quill and record your tale. Maybe no one would read it. Maybe it would mould in a dusty chest. But maybe, just maybe, some future historian would stumble across it and say, this one knew what they were doing. Because surviving a pandemic is impressive, but surviving it with receipts, that's eternal. Long before psychiatry had a name, mental illness was seen not as a medical condition but as a divine message or a curse in ancient Mesopotamia. If someone experienced hallucinations, spoke incoherently or acted erratically, the first assumption wasn't madness, it was possession. The Sumerians believed that evil spirits could enter the human body and take control. A disturbed mind meant that a demon had claimed the soul. The earliest recorded treatments were not based on logic or science. Instead, they combined ritual prayer and magic. Clay tablets from Assyria describe detailed incantations designed to drive out the spiritual invader. Exorcists were more trusted than doctors. These weren't obscure fringe beliefs. They were mainstream diagnostics in ancient Egypt. Things weren't much different. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest medical documents in existence, records both physiological and spiritual explanations for strange behaviours. If you wept without cause, forgot your own name, or withdrew from others, you might have a wandering womb or be cursed by a god. Treatment: aromatherapy, ritual purification, and appeals to divine intervention. They believed that the heart was the seat of thought, not the brain, but the Greeks took things to another level in Homeric epics. Madness is often the work of gods. Ajax slaughtered sheep thinking they were his enemies. A direct result of divine interference, the concept of divine madness became so embedded in Greek culture that it was sometimes seen as a form of inspiration. Plato even argued that some forms of madness were gifts from the gods leading to prophecy. Artistic genius or poetic insight, poets weren't mad, they were chosen. Yet it wasn't all spiritual. Hippocrates is often considered the father of modern medicine. Offered a more physical explanation, he blamed imbalances in the four bodily humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Melancholia, what we might now call depression, was an excess of black bile. His solutions are diet, rest, and lifestyle. Changes. Not bad for a man born in 460 BCE. This duality of spiritual versus physical would define how societies viewed mental illness for centuries. A person could be cursed or chemically imbalanced, a prophet or a lunatic. The line between healer and priest was razor thin, and depending on where you lived, the voices in your head could either earn you a temple or a burial in medieval Europe. Mental illness lost whatever grace it had under the gone were the Greeks and the philosophical debates about divine inspiration or humoral imbalance. Instead, the church stepped in, and with it came fire, brimstone, and fear. If you were hearing voices or seeing things that weren't there, the likely conclusion wasn't a humoral imbalance, it was sin or worse. Satan himself and madness were now framed through a religious lens. The mentally ill were often viewed as morally corrupt, spiritually weak or possessed by demons. The devil was the prime suspect. A peasant woman wandering the streets in rags, muttering to herself, might be seen as a witch. A nobleman weeping for days without cause could be accused of harbouring unconfessed sin. Confession, flagellation and prayer were considered viable treatments. Physicians deferred to priests. The institutions of the time didn't fare any better. There were few dedicated places for the mentally ill. Most were left to wander. The countryside survived in dungeons or rotted in overcrowded monasteries. In some towns they were chained in public squares for their own safety, where locals could poke them with sticks or throw coins at them for amusement. Madness became entertainment, and then came Bethlehem Royal Hospital in London, better known as Bedlam, which was founded in the 13th century. It was one of the first institutions to house the mentally disturbed, but House is putting it politely. Bedlam quickly devolved into a human zoo. Visitors would pay admission to gape at the lunatics chained to walls or howling behind barred windows. Treatments included cold water dunkings, bleeding, purging and whipping. The theory was simple: drive the devil out by force. And yet amidst the horror, some faint sparks of humanity appeared. Some monks offered kindness and shelter. Islamic physicians like Avicenna, operating far from the Inquisition's grip, still promoted humoral theory and gentle care. In Moorish Spain, hospitals treated the mentally ill with music therapy and fresh air. But in Christendom, mercy was rare and ignorance ruled. Madness in Christendom was a word soaked in dread. You didn't get help, you got chained. You didn't find healing, you found exile for most medieval sufferers. The world offered little more than a dungeon, a priest, and prayers that no one was listening to. The age of madness had begun, and it would take centuries before compassion caught up. The Renaissance is often romanticized as a period of rediscovery of beauty, science, and human potential, but for those suffering from mental illness, the shift was more complicated than hopeful. As classical knowledge resurfaced, so too did older medical ideas, especially from Hippocrates and Galen. The church's grip loosened slightly, and for a moment madness was allowed to have a body again, not just a soul. Physicians began to reframe mental illness through anatomy and imbalance rather than sin and demons. Melancholia, hysteria, and mania became recognizable terms again, treated, at least in theory, with diet, exercise, and calm surroundings. There was even a renewed interest in astrology, with the stars sometimes blamed for emotional instability. and a moody temperament. Maybe Saturn was in the wrong house, but don't mistake this for kindness. The Renaissance mind was still deeply suspicious of what it couldn't quantify, and the body was still subject to cleansing. Bloodletting remained popular, as did induced vomiting. If someone was too agitated, they might be restrained for days or subjected to spinning chairs. Designed to reset the brain in Italy and France, asylums grew more common, not out of compassion but to protect society from the unpredictable. One notable voice stood out. Johann Vier, a Dutch physician in the mid-1500s. Vier dared to claim that many so-called witches were simply mentally ill women in need of care, not execution. He wrote De Prestige Demonum on the tricks of demons, arguing against the witch trials and defending the mad from the wrath of both church and mob. Unsurprisingly, the church was not thrilled. His books were banned and his ideas largely ignored. Meanwhile, madness remained a useful tool for those in power to get rid of unwanted wives. Political rivals or rebellious daughters could be quietly declared insane and locked away. No trial, no scandal. Just a convenient diagnosis. Mental illness was as much a social weapon as a medical mystery. Art and literature, however, blossomed with depictions of madness. Think Oilia's drowning grief makes her think Doniotti's tilting at windmills. The madman became a tragic, almost romantic figure, broken by the world, lost in illusion, but society still didn't know how to help them. The Renaissance reopened the body and reignited the mind, but the soul of psychiatric care still shackled, and the Age of Enlightenment was about to make that contradiction even sharper. The Enlightenment promised reason, progress, and the triumph of science over superstition. But when it came to mental illness, the results were mixed. On one hand, the idea of locking someone up for being possessed lost credibility in the other society now needed a new excuse to marginalise the mentally ill, preferably one with a white coat and a Latin vocabulary. The asylum, once a rare curiosity, became a booming institution in London. Paris's and Vienna's grand buildings were constructed far from the city centres, where the insane could be hidden. These places, they weren't hospitals, they were warehouses. Overflowing, understaffed and reeking of neglect, they were designed less for treatment and more for isolation. The mentally, they were removed from public life like broken furniture from a showroom floor. Ironically, this was framed as progress by the French physician. Philippe Pinel famously ordered the chains removed from inmates at the Beta Asylum in 1793, a gesture widely hailed as revolutionary, but while symbolic, the reality was less idealistic. Patients might be unshackled, but they were still locked in, subjected to ice baths, forced feeding, and moral therapy, which often meant long lectures about proper behaviour delivered by a stern-faced doctor. With a stick, moral treatment became the buzzword. The idea was that mental illness stemmed from bad habits, laziness, or moral failings. So, what was the cure discipline? Order routine, no outbursts, no questioning. Think of it as a psychological boot. Camp with locked doors. Inmates were taught to follow rules, attend chapel, make their beds, and smile. At authority compliance, recovery was considered in Britain. The York Retreat emerged as a gentler model run by Quakers. It emphasised kindness, silence, and natural surroundings. Patients walked in gardens and were treated with respect. This humane model influenced others, but remained the exception, not the rule. The real shift came in paperwork for the first time. Doctors began keeping detailed notes on mental patients, charting symptoms. behaviours, and even treatment outcomes. Psychiatry was inching toward being a formal science, though it still relied heavily on guesswork and anecdote. The Enlightenment made mental illness a subject of study instead of shame. But the cost was cold sterility. In its rush to rationalise everything, society reduced the mentally ill to specimens, less demonic, yes, but still dehumanised. And on the horizon loomed the Victorian world was obsessed with propriety and terrified of what lurked in the human mind. The Victorian era was the golden age of contradictions,